One thing I have seen many historians, mythologists, religious scholars, and others make note of before is how there are hundreds of known flood stories and myths from ancient times. It's one of those things people like to point out as evidence for a worldwide flood disaster sometime in the distant past. It's possible not all of those stories are referring to the same event, as floods are fairly common occurrence throughout history. For example, the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia and the 2011 tsunami in Japan both caused massive regional flooding, but were two separate events. But if you're looking at the whole timeline of history of the entire world, the two events are very close together in time and location, so if you were trying to investigate them thousands of years from now, it might be hard to tell the two events apart. But with that said, I do think a lot of the flood stories from ancient times, maybe even most of them, do refer to one worldwide cataclysm. The entire land masses of the world might not have been covered with water completely, but I think something happened that caused some regions of the world to be covered with water, at least briefly, and in some cases for extended periods of time. Other regions that might not have been covered with water probably noticed a change in weather conditions for an extended period of time. But this brings me to the topic here. The ancient Great Flood event may have also been a turning point for human lifespans. People like to point out that there are hundreds of ancient flood stories worldwide, but I don't see people pointing out that there are also ancient stories from all around the world of people who used to have longer lifespans than people living now. Most people are familiar with the lifespans of the first humans in the Bible. They lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah, the grandfather of Noah, famously lived to be 969 years old. If you're an atheist, you probably don't pay much attention to that and just assume the ages of the original human patriarchs is just made up. If you're Jewish or Christian, you might believe it just because of faith. Some apologetics try to explain it by saying it is something numerological and isn't meant to be taken as literally hundreds of years. I can't say that I'm sure they are wrong with a numerological explanation, but I'm also not impressed by it. Does it really need to be explained away with a numerological explanation? Maybe faith alone should be enough, but is faith really all there is to look at here? Is this the only example of long-lived ancient people that later ancient people wrote about? No, it isn't. It's fairly well known by historians and ancient history buffs that the Sumerian Kings list also lists kings living before the Great Flood with long lifespans. In fact, the long lifespan of the human patriarchs in Genesis are relatively short compared to the listed reigns of the antediluvian kings of Sumeria. Their reigns are listed as lasting for many thousands of years. The first one on the list, Alulilam, if I pronounce that right, reigned for 28,800 years. The longest reigning antediluvian king, Enmenluana, is listed as reigning for 43,200 years. I'm not sure if this should be just considered the length of the entire reign or their entire lifespan, but it's possible their lifespans were thought to be even longer than their listed reigns. Kings reigning in the Middle East for thousands of years deep into prehistory may not seem to fit with your standard textbook view of world history these days. It may also be that these kings with lifespans of many thousands of years may not be added up correctly, possibly due to misunderstanding of how the ancient Sumerians were calculating them. But what I find interesting is that after the Great Flood, there is a noticeable shift in the lifespan of the kings. After the flood, Jushur, the first listed ruler of the dynasty of Kish, was listed as having a reign of 1,200 years. Still a very long time compared to the modern lifespans or even the lifespans of the original patriarchs in Genesis, but far shorter than the reigns of the antediluvian kings before him. During the first dynasty of Kish, the kings ruled for only hundreds of years, not thousands. It's not until later in the Uruk dynasty that you start to see kings listed with reigns that are more in line with what you would expect to see with modern human lifespans. Ur-Nungal, the son of Gilgamesh, reigned for 30 years. Some of the others after him reigned for less than 10 years. Although there isn't a clear correlation of the Sumerian Kings list with the original human patriarchs in the Bible where you can match a Sumerian king to the same time as a specific patriarch in Genesis, What I find interesting is how they differentiate the lifespans of the antediluvian kings and the ones after the flood. It's basically the same thing you see in the Bible. People who lived before the flood had longer lifespans than people born after the flood. Why is this? Another question could be, what is even the point in making up these long lifespans of people before the flood if it isn't true? Why say, okay, well, this is how long people live now, but back in the day, they lived much longer? Could it be because that made it seem like the earlier time was a much better time than they could look back to, some kind of golden age? Many cultures write of a golden age in their past. Could they have all made it up with some kind of hope of getting back to it? Or is the reason so many wrote of a golden age is because there actually was a golden age in the distant past, or for them, a still recent time? If they were just making up the lifespans of the antediluvian people, then why give them all seemingly random lengths of time in the reign? Why not just say they all reigned the same amount of time? One verse in Genesis that I feel doesn't get much attention is Genesis 6:3. It says, "Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. This is something God said after the flood, and after that most people lived what would now be considered a modern lifespan. I also find it interesting how specific that number is, because it is essentially what seems to be the maximum lifespan of a modern human. Of course, we know most people in recorded history haven't actually lived all the way to 120 years, but other than a few questions of very questionable veracity, the only modern human with the record of longest lifespan was a French woman said to have lived 122 years, although there are those that question the veracity of even that record. Basically, everyone else in official recorded history hasn't lived to be more than 120 years, though. I find it interesting that in Genesis the record states that lifespans would be changing to what we now know as the modern human lifespan, which is much shorter than people living prior to the flood. Being that so many cultures around the world wrote of ancient people with long lifespans or a golden age, I feel like there must be something more to it, not just something that everyone was making up in ancient times. I'll get to some more of those stories later, but if there were ancient people with long lifespans, then what happened? How were they able to live so much longer than modern humans? It is hard to say what might have changed. It seems to me it might have something to do with some kind of environmental or atmospheric change. I don't know what exactly that might have been, but it seems to me the changes in the environment or atmosphere could have an effect on lifespans one way or the other. You could also say it's just a supernatural thing, and God said it that way. But even if that is the case, I think there may still have been some noticeable, or at least measurable, change in the environment or atmosphere caused by the effect of divine intervention. I've seen people try to debunk ancients living long lifespans, but I'm not convinced they can really debunk it. If there was an environmental or atmospheric change that caused a lifespan change, I'm not sure they know what the change to look for specifically, or if it would even be easy to find. I also don't know that they have a way to really tell how old a prehistoric body is at the time of its death. They basically base their assessment on how a modern human ages. As an example, they may find a body that appears to them to have been around 35 years old at the time of death. But can they really know how old they would be if the ancient people had longer lifespans? If ancient people age slower, then what would appear to be the age of around 35 years in a modern human might be the equivalent of a 350-year-old person in ancient times if ancient people had longer lifespans. I'm just speculating with that there, but I don't know how modern scientists can really prove that one way or the other. Senescence is a term they have in science that refers to biological aging. More specifically, it refers to the cellular degradation in living organisms that show the signs of aging. The rate of senescence varies wildly among different organisms. Most animals don't live as long as humans. Most cats and dogs have lifespans that are usually not more than 20 years, although there are some that have lived a little longer than that. Some types of parrots and tortoises can live to be 100 years old, sometimes longer. The differences in these lifespans is due to the rate of senescence in different species of animals. Some age slower than others. there are some organisms that have what is called negligible senescence, meaning they don't show signs of biological aging. Lobsters are one example of an organism with negligible senescence. In most organisms, when cells divide and to create new cells, the telomeres of the cells erode slightly. Telomeres are the protective caps at the end of each chromosome. The erosion of the telomeres over time is what causes biological aging. Cells in lobsters do not show signs of eroding over time like most other organisms, which means they have negligible senescence. This doesn't necessarily mean they're immortal, as long as they can avoid getting caught and eaten, but they do have long lifespans, longer than most other animals, and don't show signs of aging as they get older once they reach adulthood. Is it possible ancient humans could have had a rate of senescence that is much slower than modern humans? I do think it's possible, even if I don't have a scientific explanation as to how or why it is possible. The thing is, I don't know that scientists have a way they can measure the senescence of ancient humans. They can only assume it based on what they know of modern humans. So if we're going to consider the possibility that ancient humans could have lived long lifespans, what are some other stories there of ancient humans with long lifespans? Starting in the ancient Near East, there are Jewish legends outside of the Bible that have to do with aging as well. According to one legend, before the time of the patriarch Abraham, people did not show signs of aging. It was actually Abraham that asked God to make it so people would show signs of aging. It's not specific on what those signs are, but I assume it had to do with gray in hair and wrinkles. He wanted to be able to tell how old a person was just by looking at them. Perhaps it's a way to help keep a young girl from dating an 80-year-old man who still looks like he's 25. Another Jewish legend is similar to this. It says that prior to the time of the patriarch Jacob, men would die without any physical warning signs. It's similar to the previous legend, but this one has more to do with signs of physical ailments and not necessarily with appearance. Both of these examples are of stories that don't refer to long lifespans, but to a time when people did not appear to age like they do now. That's not the only example of ancient people who didn't appear to age, but before we move out of the ancient Near East, I also want to point out the Sumerian Kings list, which lists the ancient kings of Egypt. Similar to the Sumerian Kings list, the Sumerian Kings list starts with an era of gods who reigned thousands of years, then move into another age of demigods and spirit kings of Egypt, before moving into an era of human kings. According to Manetho, the Egyptian gods and demigods ruled for 24,925 years. Hesiod wrote of multiple ages of men, starting with a golden age where men lived like gods without sorrow and grief, and with legs and arms never failing. When they died, it's like they were overcome with sleep. This also sounds to me like a time where men did not appear to age. Plato and Ovid also wrote about multiple ages, starting with the Golden Age. According to Hesiod, the Golden Age ended when Zeus punished Prometheus for giving men fire and other arts. The Athenians had a festival known as Chronia, where the Golden Age was celebrated, where slaves, free people, poor people, and rich people would all dine together to represent freedom from work and social egalitarianism, like how it was in the Golden Age. Greeks also talked of a place called Hyperborea. The Hyperboreans were said to live 1,000 years. In my notes, I also wrote down that the Roman author Servius wrote of people in Arcadia who lived to be 300 years old. However, I couldn't figure out where I got that from, and I couldn't find it online either. But I decided to go ahead and mention it here just because I know other people like Virgil wrote about it being an idyllic golden age kind of place. Lucian wrote about people called the Ceres and said they could live to be over 300 years old. This might be a bad example, though, because Lucian was known for writing satire, so this might have been sarcasm on his part. This isn't even the only example of Lucian writing about long-lived ancient people, but because he was a satirical writer, his story should be taken with a grain of salt. I only mention it here because if he was writing satire with long-lived ancient people in it, he must have known already existing stories of long-lived ancient people he wanted to write satire on. Persian mythology lists several shahs that are said to have lived for hundreds of years. The oldest one, Zahak, was said to have lived for 1,000 years. The ones after him gradually lived shorter lifespans, with the most recent ones living 120 years. This is another example of lifespans shifting from really long to more modern lifespans. Yima was said to rule for hundreds of years, and good men lived long lives without sickness, and they looked young. This is similar to how in Jewish legend people did not show signs of aging prior to Abraham and Jacob. The Rama Empire in India was said to have lasted thousands of years and had long-lived rulers. In Jainism, the Tirthankaras were said to live thousands of years. The Tirthankaras were spiritual teachers, and there were 24 of them, and the first 22 lived thousands of years, and the last 2 lived modern human lifespans. This is another example of a list of people who live long lifespans, transitioning into what we know as a modern human lifespan at a certain point in time, much like how in the Near East the change in lifespan was thought to have occurred after the time of the Great Flood. Bhishma in Hinduism is thought to have lived anywhere from 130 years to 370 years old. The Yuga cycle in Hinduism refers to a cyclical age where humanity's general moral and physical state decrease by 1/4. This is another reference to earlier ages where people lived longer. I've also heard of a Hindu story that says men could choose to live as long as they want without the fear of death. The first 18 Hung kings of Vietnam are said to have all lived to be over 200 years old. The oldest one is said to have lived to be 692 years old. Some early emperors of Japan were said to have reigned for over 100 years, with Emperor Jimmu said to have lived for 126 years. This one would have been from the 8th to 6th centuries BC, so this would have actually been after the period of time typically attributed to long-lived ancient peoples. Fuji in Chinese mythology was a creator god along with his wife Nuwa. Fuji was said to have lived for 197 years. Zuoqi was said to have lived for more than 300 years. The Yellow Emperor of China was said to have lived for 113 years. So that's more in the modern lifespan, granted, but that's still pretty long. Pingzu was said to live for over 800 years. The Wichita of Oklahoma have a legend of a time when people existed with supernatural powers and can control the forces of nature and live extraordinarily long lifespans. The Hopi have a legend of multiple ages that, like the Greek myth of multiple ages, each age becomes less harmonious than the previous generation, and starting with an original generation that was happy. I'm not sure how long they were thought to have lived, but I mention it because of the similarity to the Greek myth of multiple ages. The Aztec also had a legend of multiple ages, or what they called the 5 Suns. In Freddie Silva's book, The Missing Lands, he mentions 12 Mayan dynasties reigning for 16,000 years that he got from the Troyano manuscripts. However, I'm not sure if that's original research or not. He doesn't really cite anything else for that, and I couldn't find any other reference to that. I thought maybe he was talking about the Mayan long count calendar, but I don't know how he would have come up with the number specifically, 16,000 years. So take that one for what you will. I mention it here, though, because if you've ever heard of that anywhere else, let me know. Astrology is one of the oldest things known to man. Some of the ancient astrologers were able to create calendars and calculate long periods of time based on the movement of the stars and planets. Think of the complexity of a calendar like the Mayan calendar that accounts for thousands of years of time. They could have figured this out by watching the skies, and this alone would be evidence of them excelling in mathematics. But I think it would have probably been a lot easier to figure it all out if their ancestors had lived long lives, because that would give them more time as individuals to watch and accurately measure all the movements of the stars, and then pass that information on to later generations to use. There may also be something to say here about all the megalithic stone structures around the world. Think of places like the pyramids of Egypt and Teotihuacan, as well as Cholula, the largest known pyramid by volume in the world, or massive stone structures at Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman in Peru. or in southeast Turkey with structures at sites like Göbekli Tepe that have megalithic stone structures that archaeologists say are even older than all of those other sites and many others. Some people say aliens built them. Some people say giants built them. Mainstream academic historians are usually of the opinion that normal ancient humans built them, just using a large workforce and spending a lot of time on it. The builders of the ancient megaliths of the world is a fascinating subject on its own. I'm pretty open-minded about the possibilities. I will say I'm more on the skeptical side when it comes to attributing them to aliens, at least in the context of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, but I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility. Giants may be more likely than aliens, as giants are also spoken of in ancient stories and myths from around the world. Although I still don't know that megalithic structures necessarily need to all be attributed to giants. I wonder why average-sized humans who supposedly didn't have the proper tools to be able to cut, move, and place megalithic stones would even think about, much less want to bother trying to do it at all, when they could still build the same structures using smaller, more manageable stones or bricks. But, just saying, if they lived extremely long lives, spending 20 years building one megalithic building might not seem like that long of a time to them. Another thing to consider is why humans might have shifted to shorter lifespans than their ancestors at some point in time. While maybe some kind of change in the environment or in their DNA may have been the cause, there may also have been a need for more rapid repopulation. A long childhood and adolescence period is something an evolved species with large numbers can subsist on over time. But to reproduce faster, a species with a shorter childhood would be needed to lower the risk of extinction. A shorter childhood would have them be able to reproduce at an earlier age. After a cataclysm like a flood, having a shorter childhood and reproducing faster may have been necessary to repopulate. So whether it be a divine intervention or just nature, being able to reproduce faster may have been what allowed humans to repopulate the earth rapidly. This started for me as a curiosity as to why the people living before the flood in Genesis were listed as having such long lifespans. I wondered if any other ancient stories might also tell of people who had long lifespans. It was easy to find a lot of information about the Sumerian Kings list. It might be hard to correlate any of the long-lived kings on the Sumerian Kings list with anyone in Genesis, simply because the Sumerian Kings are listed as having lives so much longer than even the first people in Genesis. Perhaps we should be making a distinction between the pre-flood patriarchs of Genesis and the Sumerian Kings list, in that we know that Adam and Eve are said to be the first humans, whereas the antediluvian kings of Sumer may not have been modern humans or directly related to Adam and Eve in any way. Maybe the antediluvian kings of Sumer were from some other humanoid or human-like race of people. We know in the archaeological record there are other types of humans found. The Neanderthals, Denisovans, or Denisovans, however you like to pronounce it, and Homo erectus, just to name a few. I don't know that any of those races of people represent the antediluvian kings of Sumer. Perhaps they belong to another race entirely that no one has ever found in the archaeological record. I don't know. I can only speculate about it. I don't know if we can ever confirm in any physical or scientific way that the antediluvian kings of Sumer ever existed at all. But what I found interesting about it was that, similar to Genesis, it shows a time where people lived long lives, then later shifts to modern human lifespans. It was interesting to me that the Turin Kings list of Egypt was similar to the Sumerian Kings list in that way as well. It starts with long-lived gods ruling as kings, then later shifts to people with modern human lifespans. But I wondered if this ancient view of the even more ancient world was limited to the Near East and North Africa. The Hebrews, Sumerians, and Egyptians all lived relatively close to each other and interacted with each other at various times, so I started to look elsewhere. What I found is that there are stories from all around the world that speak of ancient people with long lifespans or who didn't show signs of aging. There are also stories of a golden age where people lived in harmony and did not fear death. With all those stories in mind, it seemed clear to me that ancient people thought their ancestors lived lives longer than their own. It seems to me that this is evidence of some golden age where people lived together harmonious in a paradise-type environment. But I don't know if we will ever be able to scientifically prove it now. But I also don't think anyone will ever be able to prove that it never happened either. Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.